In the dusty archives of a small German town library sits a daguerreotype that will chill your blood. The year is 1847. The subject appears to be an innocent child of perhaps 12 years old, with piercing blue eyes and an unsettling smile that seems to know secrets no child should possess. This photograph, discovered only in 1973, shows Heinrich Wilhelm Zimmermann, the man who would become the most prolific killer in recorded history. But this is not just another true crime story. This is the tale of how evil incarnate walked among us for over 7 decades, hiding behind the mask of respectability while orchestrating a campaign of terror that spanned 3 countries and claimed over 3,000 lives. The boy in that 1847 photograph was born Heinrich Wilhelm Zimmermann in the Bavarian village of Rothenburg, Oberdirt. His father, Klaus, was the village undertaker, a detail that would prove horrifically prophetic. His mother, Maria, died under mysterious circumstances when Heinrich was just 9 years old. The official cause of death was listed as consumption, but village records, discovered centuries later, revealed disturbing inconsistencies in her final days. Heinrich was described by his schoolmaster as unnaturally intelligent, but possessed of a coldness that made grown men uncomfortable. Other children avoided him instinctively. Animals would flee his presence. Even as a child, there were signs, dead birds found arranged in ritualistic patterns around his home, neighborhood cats that simply vanished without trace, and most disturbing of all, the way he would watch funeral processions with an expression of pure fascination. The 1847 photograph was taken by traveling photographer Johann Müller, who later wrote in his journal about the unsettling experience. The boy stood perfectly still for the required exposure time, Müller wrote, but there was something in his eyes that made my hands shake as I developed the plate. I felt as though I was capturing not a child's innocence, but glimpsing into an abyss of darkness that should not exist in one so young. By age 15, Heinrich had already claimed his first victim, though the world wouldn't know for another 60 years. The village baker's daughter, Anna Hoffmann, aged 13, was found dead in the woods outside Rothenburg. Her body showed signs of ritualistic mutilation that police attributed to wild animals. But Heinrich knew better. He had spent weeks planning every detail, studying her routines, learning her fears. Anna was not random, she was practice. The death went unsolved. And Heinrich learned his first crucial lesson. Authority figures were surprisingly easy to deceive. His respectful demeanor, his position as the undertaker's son, his evident intelligence, these became his camouflage. While investigators searched for a savage killer in the woods, the real monster served them tea and answered their questions with helpful concern. In 1852, Heinrich left Rothenburg for Munich, ostensibly to study medicine, but medical school was merely another hunting ground. Over the next 4 years, 11 students would die in what authorities classified as a series of unfortunate accidents and suicides. Heinrich was developing his methodology, making murder look like anything but murder. A supposed fall from a dormitory window here, an apparent suicide by poisoning there, tragic accident involving laboratory chemicals. Each death taught him something new about human anatomy, about toxicology, about the infinite ways a life could be snuffed out while leaving investigators none the wiser. Heinrich was not just killing, he was conducting research. His victims were unwitting participants in his twisted education. Dr. Friedrich Weiss, Heinrich's anatomy professor, would later describe his star pupil as brilliant beyond measure. But there was something wrong with young Zimmermann. He showed no emotion when dissecting cadavers, not the usual queasiness of students, but something worse. He seemed to take pleasure in it. I began to fear that we were training not a healer, but something far more sinister. Dr. Weiss's fears were justified. By 1856, Heinrich had graduated with highest honors and secured a position at Munich General Hospital. For the medical establishment, it was a triumph. A brilliant young doctor, ready to serve humanity. For Heinrich, it was the keys to the kingdom. Never again would he need to work alone or in haste. Now he had unlimited access to the sick, the dying, and the vulnerable, all under the sacred protection of medical privilege. The Munich General Hospital period represents Heinrich's transition from amateur to professional. Between 1856 and 1863, over 400 patients died under his care. A mortality rate that, while raising some eyebrows, was explained away by his willingness to take the most challenging cases. Heinrich had learned to hide his skills among the naturally dying, selecting victims whose deaths would seem inevitable and unremarkable. But it wasn't enough anymore. The thrill was fading. Heinrich needed new challenges, new territories, new identities. In 1863, He faked his own death in a supposed laboratory explosion and emerged 3 months later in Vienna as Dr. Wilhelm Hartmann, a specialist in internal medicine with impeccable credentials from a German university that had unfortunately burned down, taking all records with it. Vienna marked the beginning of Heinrich's international phase. As Dr. Hartmann, he established a private practice catering to wealthy patients, seeking discretion for embarrassing ailments. What they found instead was death disguised as medical misadventure. Over 7 years, 38 of Vienna's elite died under his care, their deaths attributed to everything from heart failure to complications from surgery. The beauty of Heinrich's method was its apparent randomness. His victims shared no common characteristics beyond their wealth and their misfortune in seeking his services. There was no pattern for investigators to discern, no signature that might reveal his true nature. He was the perfect predator, invisible among his prey, but Heinrich's appetite was growing beyond what even his medical practice could satisfy. He began supplementing his professional kills with freelance work seemingly random. Crimes that police attributed to robbery or crime of passion. A wealthy widow found dead in her mansion, apparently the victim of a burglary gone wrong. A young nobleman discovered in an alley with his throat cut, presumably killed for his purse. A merchant's family found poisoned at their dinner table, their deaths blamed on contaminated food. Each kill was a masterpiece of misdirection. Each scene was carefully crafted to tell a story that led investigators away from the truth. Heinrich had become a playwright of death, scripting elaborate narratives that starred his victims in their own final moments, while casting himself as an invisible supporting character. In 1870, as the Franco-Prussian War convulsed Europe, Heinrich saw opportunity in chaos. He enlisted as a field surgeon, not out of patriotism, but because war zones provided perfect cover for his activities. Who would question additional deaths when men were dying by the thousands? Who would investigate suspicious fatalities when the medical staff was overwhelmed and records were spotty? For 8 months, Heinrich served with distinction on the battlefield, saving lives during the day and ending them during the night. Wounded soldiers who should have recovered mysteriously died from infections. Officers who trusted their surgeon with their personal problems were found dead in their tents, apparently victims of enemy snipers or their own despair. Heinrich later claimed that his wartime period was the most productive of his career, though the exact number of victims remains unknown. When the war ended, Dr. Wilhelm Hartmann returned to Vienna as a decorated hero. The respect and admiration he received only deepened his contempt for humanity. These people celebrated him, trusted him with their lives, when he was the very embodiment of what they feared most. It was intoxicating and enraging in equal measure. By 1875, even Vienna was becoming too small for Heinrich's ambitions. He needed a fresh start, a new identity, a virgin hunting ground. America beckoned a young nation where a man could reinvent himself completely, where records were scarce and questions were few. Heinrich Zimmermann died for the second time, and Dr. Henry Williams was born. Dr. Henry Williams arrived in New York City in the spring of 1875, with outstanding credentials, substantial funds, and letters of introduction from prominent European physicians who unfortunately could not be contacted due to various untimely deaths. He established a practice on the Upper East Side, catering to families who valued privacy above all else. New York in the 1870s was perfect for Heinrich's purposes. The city was growing rapidly, filled with immigrants and transients, whose disappearances might not be noticed. Medical practice was largely unregulated. Death certificates were often filed without investigation. Heinrich had found paradise. For 15 years, Dr. Henry Williams was considered one of New York's finest physicians. He was invited to the best social events, trusted with the most sensitive cases, consulted on the most complex medical mysteries. All the while, he was systematically killing his patients, their family members, and anyone else who struck his fancy. The Blackwood family massacre of 1882 was typical of Heinrich's New York period. Summoned to treat the patriarch's bout of influenza, Dr. Williams instead introduced a cocktail of toxins that killed not just his patient, but the man's wife, 3 children, and 2 servants over the course of a week. The deaths were attributed to a virulent strain of the flu, and Dr. Williams was praised for his heroic efforts to save the family. The insurance payout was substantial, and a grateful portion found its way into the good doctor's account. But Heinrich was evolving beyond simple murder for profit. He was becoming an artist, and art required experimentation. He began studying the psychological effects of prolonged terror, keeping some victims alive for days or weeks, while systematically destroying their sanity. He developed new toxins that produced specific symptoms, allowing him to stage elaborate medical dramas with himself as the star. Physician battling mysterious ailments. The Morrison case of 1886 demonstrates the sophisticated cruelty Heinrich had developed. Called to treat a young woman's recurring headaches, he instead administered a slow-acting neurotoxin of his own creation. Over 3 months, he documented her gradual descent into madness, her family's growing desperation, and their absolute faith in his expertise. When she finally died, screaming about demons that only she could see, Dr. Williams published a paper on rare neurological conditions that was hailed as groundbreaking research. By 1890, Heinrich had been killing for decades, but his appetite remained insatiable. If anything, success had made him more reckless. He began taking unnecessary risks, killing victims whose deaths might raise questions, leaving subtle signatures that could potentially link his crimes. It was as though part of him wanted to be caught, wanted the world to know what he had accomplished. The turning point came with the death of Detective Lieutenant Thomas Murray of the New York Police Department. Murray had been investigating a series of suspicious deaths among the city's elite patients of Dr. Henry Williams. When Murray himself became a patient after a riding accident, Heinrich couldn't resist the irony of killing the one man who might expose him. But Murray's death was too convenient, too perfectly timed. His partner, Detective Sergeant Patrick O'Brien, refused to let the case die with his colleague. O'Brien began his own investigation, and he possessed something that had been lacking in previous inquiries: the suspicion that the deaths might not be unconnected accidents. Heinrich knew he was being watched. He could feel O'Brien's eyes on him at social gatherings, could sense the investigation tightening around him like a noose. For the first time in his career, he was experiencing what his victims had felt, the gradual realization that death was approaching, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But Heinrich Zimmermann was not going to die quietly in a prison cell. If his career was ending, it would end spectacularly. On the night of October 31st, 1890, he set fire to his Manhattan practice, with himself inside. The building burned completely, taking with it all records of his patients, all evidence of his crimes, and supposedly, Dr. Henry Williams himself. Except Heinrich wasn't dead. He had staged his third and final death, emerging from the flames as Thomas Whitmore, a traveling minister who had witnessed the terrible tragedy and devoted his life to bringing comfort to those who had lost loved ones in medical tragedies. Reverend Thomas Whitmore represented Heinrich's final evolution. No longer content with individual murders, he began targeting entire communities. Moving from town to town across the American frontier, he would establish a church, gain the trust of the local population, and then systematically poison congregation members, blaming their deaths on everything from tainted water supplies to God's mysterious will. The Millbrook tragedy of 1893 was Heinrich's masterpiece of mass murder. In this small Colorado town, he convinced the entire population that they were living through biblical end times, and that only through shared sacrifice could they achieve salvation. Over a period of 3 months, he orchestrated the deaths of 247 residents, making it appear as though the community had been struck by a series of natural disasters and mysterious illnesses. When investigators finally arrived in Millbrook, they found a ghost town with Reverend Whitmore as the sole survivor, traumatized by the loss of his flock and bearing witness to God's terrible judgment. The state attributed the deaths to a combination of severe weather, contaminated food supplies, and mass hysteria. Heinrich collected insurance money on behalf of the victims' families and moved on to his next target. For 7 more years, Reverend Whitmore traveled the frontier, leaving devastation in his wake. The Greendale influenza of 1895 killed 63. The Riverside mine disaster of 1897 claimed 41 lives. The Oakwood school fire of 1899 burned alive 37 children and 5 teachers. Each tragedy was perfectly orchestrated, carefully documented, and completely attributed to natural causes or human negligence. But time was Heinrich's ultimate enemy. By 1900, he was 73 years old, and his body was beginning to betray the mind that had orchestrated so much death. His hands shook when preparing poisons. His memory occasionally failed him during crucial moments. Worst of all, he was beginning to experience something he had never felt before: remorse. Not remorse for his victims. Heinrich remained utterly indifferent to their suffering, but remorse for the approaching end of his career, for all the kills he would never make, for the masterpieces of death he would never create. The thought of dying a natural death in bed, unrecognized and unappreciated, was unbearable. Heinrich decided that his final act would also be his revelation. On Christmas Eve, 1900, Reverend Thomas Whitmore called together the entire population of Cedar Falls, Wyoming, for a special midnight service. The 156 residents who attended expected to hear readings from Scripture. Instead, they heard the confession of Heinrich Wilhelm Zimmermann. For 2 hours, Heinrich detailed his crimes, his methods, his philosophy of death. He spoke of the child in the 1847 photograph, who had dreamed of greatness and achieved it through destruction. He described the intoxicating power of holding life and death in his hands, of watching fear bloom in his victims' eyes as they realized their fate. He confessed to over 3,000 murders, spanning 6 decades and 3 continents. The congregation sat in stunned silence as their trusted minister revealed himself as the monster who had haunted their nightmares. Some prayed, some wept, some simply stared in horrified fascination at the embodiment of evil standing before them. All were paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of what they were hearing. Heinrich concluded his confession by explaining that everyone present would die that night, that he had poisoned the communion wine they had all consumed at the beginning of the service. The toxin was already coursing through their veins, and within hours, Cedar Falls would become his final masterpiece. Entire community united in death by the greatest killer in human history. But Heinrich had made a crucial error. Among the congregation was Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a young physician visiting her parents for Christmas. Dr. Mitchell recognized the symptoms Heinrich described and realized that the poison he had used was one she had studied during her medical training. More importantly, she knew the antidote. As Heinrich continued his rambling confession, reveling in his victims' growing terror, Dr. Mitchell quietly began preparing a treatment using supplies from her medical bag and materials from the church kitchen. She worked in shadows, praying that Heinrich's ego would keep him talking long enough for her to save as many lives as possible. When Heinrich finally noticed Dr. Mitchell's activities, he flew into a rage unlike anything his victims had ever witnessed. This was not the cold, calculating killer who had orchestrated so many deaths, but a man consumed by fury at having his final performance interrupted by an amateur. He lunged at Dr. Mitchell with a knife hidden beneath his robes, intent on butchering her in front of the dying congregation. But 73 years of age had taken their toll. Heinrich stumbled, fell, and struck his head against the church's stone altar. He lay there bleeding, conscious but unable to move, forced to watch as Dr. Mitchell distributed the antidote to his intended victims. One by one, the people of Cedar Falls began to recover, their lives snatched back from the brink by the young doctor's knowledge and courage. Heinrich Wilhelm Zimmermann died as the sun rose on Christmas morning, 1900. His last words, spoken to Dr. Mitchell as she knelt beside him attempting to provide medical aid, were, "You don't understand. I gave them meaning. Without me, they were nothing. With me, they became part of something greater than themselves." Dr. Mitchell later wrote that she would never forget the look in his eyes as he spoke those final words. Not the remorse of a dying man, but the satisfaction of an artist contemplating his completed work. Even in death, Heinrich showed no recognition that his victims were human beings deserving of life and dignity. To the very end, they remained nothing more than materials for his twisted craft. The Cedar Falls incident, as it came to be known, sent shockwaves through American society. The idea that a single individual could orchestrate such massive destruction, while maintaining a facade of respectability, challenged every assumption about the nature of evil. Investigators who examined Heinrich's various identities and crime scenes estimated that his actual victim count exceeded 4,000 souls, making him responsible for more deaths than many wars. The 1847 photograph of young Heinrich Zimmermann became evidence in the largest criminal investigation in American history. Experts studied every detail of that innocent-seeming child's face, searching for signs of the monster he would become. What they found was perhaps more disturbing than any obvious signs of malevolence: the complete absence of anything that might have warned the world of what was coming. That photograph hangs today in the FBI's Criminal Psychology Department, a reminder that evil does not always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it smiles with a child's face, speaks with a physician's authority, and prays with a minister's voice. Sometimes the greatest monsters are those who walk among us undetected, trusted and respected, until the moment they choose to reveal their true nature. The boy in the 1847 photograph became the greatest murderer of the century, not through superhuman strength or obvious madness, but through patience, intelligence, and an absolute lack of human empathy. His story serves as a chilling reminder that the capacity for ultimate evil can hide behind any face, speak with any voice, and wear any mask society provides. Heinrich Wilhelm Zimmermann's legacy is not just the thousands of lives he took, but the terrible knowledge that such monsters exist among us, perfectly camouflaged, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal their true nature. The child in that 1847 photograph reminds us that evil is not always born. Sometimes it simply chooses to be, and that choice can echo through decades of death and destruction. In the end, Heinrich got his wish for recognition, though not in the way he imagined. He is remembered not as the artistic genius he believed himself to be, but as a cautionary tale about the depths of human depravity. The innocent child in the 1847 photograph became a monster, but more terrifyingly, he became proof that such monsters can hide in plain sight for entire lifetimes, accumulating victims, while society remains obliviously grateful for their service. The photograph remains a frozen moment of apparent innocence that masks the greatest evil of an age. It serves as a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who never appear dangerous at all, who earn our trust precisely so they can betray it in the most horrific ways imaginable. The boy who would become the century's greatest murderer understood this truth better than anyone, and he used it to orchestrate a campaign of terror that spanned continents and decades, leaving behind only death, grief, and the haunting question of how many other monsters might be hiding among us, waiting for their moment to strike.